This is Finn, and welcome to another UPE tutorial. Today we'll be going over what functions are and how to create functions in Python. So you may know functions from algebra, and one example of a function that you may see in algebra is f of x equals x. But you've already seen some functions in Python. One example of a function you've seen is print, which can accept a number, it can accept a string, it can accept a lot of things, and it'll give you the output of what that thing is. Another function you've seen is len, which is the length function, and that'll give you the amount of things in a list, or it'll give you the length of a string. Anyway, the point is all of these functions, they do a lot of things, and they likely run other Python code. And that's really essentially what a function is. It's code that's been grouped together and will run every time you run the function. So real quick, I'm going to create a function for you, and I'll show you how to make functions in Python. And so the function I'm going to make with the def keyword, this means define, it means we're defining a new function, it's going to be called fancy hello. And I'm going to put two parentheses at the end here. And because there's nothing in these parentheses, it implies that there's not going to be any input to this function. And so fancy hello is going to do one thing, which is print the word hello with some squiggles around it. And so to run this function, what we can then do is write fancy hello and add the parentheses to the end. And if I save that and run it, you will see over here it runs our function and outputs hello. And I can run this multiple times as well. I can run fancy hello, I'll run it 4 times, and you can see it runs here 4 times. And so this is great because it means we can edit code in one place, for instance adding an exclamation point, and then every time we run that function it's going to make that change. But not all functions necessarily should do one thing with no basis of any input. I might have said that weirdly, but what I essentially mean is that lots of functions want some sort of input, and so I'll show you now how to add arguments by making another function called fancy message. And this is going to accept one argument called msg, which means, is going to be a variable, which means message. And I will write print and our squiggles, and we're going to add the message, and then we're going to add more squiggles. And so now if I run fancy message and I say Python rocks, you will see that running fancy message accepts our string input and then outputs Python rocks. And so this is great because now we can give input to a function, and what that function does can be based on that input. Now I'm going to show you one other function, and I'll jump over to that function right now. Alright, and so now I have this other function for you called C to F, and this is a Celsius to Fahrenheit converter. And as you can see, it accepts cell, which is a variable for the Celsius input, and then it will create this variable far using the mathematical formula for converting, and then print out this sentence. And I run it 3 times with different numbers, and if we run that real quick, you can see that it indeed does take our input and do the conversions and send that output. But what if we want to use the converted Fahrenheit perhaps in another function? Or what if we want to do something with this Fahrenheit in our Python code besides printing it? Just think on that for a sec. And one thing you might come up with is we've defined this far variable. And so if we then go, maybe we can use far in other functions once we've run our function. And so as you can see, far is not defined anywhere but inside of this function. And if we want to add one more thing, we can, to not get this error, we can add a declaration for far beforehand of 10, and as you can see, far holds its value of 10 after all of these functions are run. And so this begins to introduce the idea of scope, which means where variables are defined affects where they can be used. And we're not going to get into this too much right now, but the general rule of thumb is that when you create a variable inside of a function, that variable is only going to be usable inside of that function. And variables you create outside of functions should generally only be used when they are passed as arguments into the function. But going back, how the heck are we going to get far out of this function to be used elsewhere in our code? And the answer is a little guy called return. And so if I write return, I'm going to get rid of this print statement and write return far. Now what's going to happen is C to F, when it runs, it's going to return the converted value. And in order to use that value, we need to assign it to a variable. And so if I set x equal to the output of 100 Celsius converted to Fahrenheit, and then we print x, you will see that it indeed does print out 212. And so this is great because now we've assigned our returned output to a variable, and we can use it anywhere else inside of our Python code. One thing we could also do is we can just write right inside of the print statement C to F, and since it returns the value, you will see that it returns 32 and then takes in that 32 and prints it. So generally when you're outputting information from a function, you're going to be doing it with print statements or return statements. Generally speaking though, I would suggest using return statements as much as you can, because it allows you again to use your functions elsewhere in your code rather than just printing out to the user. Generally speaking, in your programming career, you're going to find that return lets you be more flexible with how you use your functions. And so also, one more thing to add is what happens if maybe in this function I also want to let the user know that the value has been converted successfully, and so I can print out here converted. So if I save that and I run it, you can see that converted doesn't actually get printed. And so this is important to note because as soon as a function hits a return statement, it's not going to run any code after it returns. It's just going to return, and then everything outside of that function is going to continue running. So if you want, for instance, to print values, you need to do so before you return. This is another source of error, and as you can see, converted was printed twice actually, and that's because we run C to F here and C to F here. So both times converted is being printed, even though we aren't printing the value of x. You can also return nothing as an option. And returning nothing just means that our code is going to cut off early. So say you have an if statement that checks if your input is suitable to use in the rest of your function. And if it isn't, you could print danger, input not valid, and then just write return, and it will not, and let's see what that returns. And as you can see, it returns the word none. And none is I guess a data type, you can call it, inside of Python that just means that nothing was returned. And so return has multiple uses and can be used to stop your code or to stop your function or to return values from your function. And so real quick, I thought I'd show you one more function called isNegative. And this takes x, which hopefully will be a number, and if x is less than 0, then we return true. And here I make a note where I've gotten rid of this else statement that you would normally see here, because if true is returned, then the function's done and it's not going to return false. However, if this if statement isn't true, then it will go down here and return false. So that's what that function can look like, and that would just tell you if it's negative. But even if you wanted to shorten this even more, you could and let me run this. As you can see, is -1 is -1, and we got invalid syntax because I forgot to write def. But if I include def and we run this, then as you can see, it returns false because that's not negative, and then true because that is negative. We can shorten this function even more and bring it down to one return statement just by writing return x less than 0. And if we run that, then it will evaluate if x is less than 0 and just return that. So there's a lot of ways of writing functions, and it's up to you to find what makes the most sense to you and what you think is the most readable type of function you can create. But I just thought I would show an example where there is multiple return statements to explain how that works. And so going back to our other functions here, say we want to apply this idea of returning to these functions. We could create a new function called fancy string. And as you might guess, this is, instead of printing, we're going to return our fancy string. And then, I'll just do some quick changes here. I'll change that to string, and then we'll print the output of that. And as you can see, that does work the same way. But now, in theory, we could use this fancy string elsewhere in our code besides just printing it. But what if you want to have multiple input values to our code? One example of that could be changing these fancy squiggles to other fancy designs around our code. You can have multiple input arguments for a function. And an example of that would be, the way to do that would be to add a comma and then add the name of your next variable that you want to have as input in your function. So we'll use the word design, and if we add the word design here and here, we can now add a second argument when we run fancy string with some fancy design. And so here I'll do a fancy little dot dash pattern. And as you can see now, we have that being passed through to our function. And so and you can have as many inputs as you want. And the great thing about this is it lets you have functions that can do a ton of different things based on a whole bunch of input. One more thing to mention is that if you have an array as your input to your function, you might get something occurring that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And so here I'll explain what my code is doing, and then we can see what happens. We have this fruity function here, which accepts a list of fruits and then appends kiwi to that list of fruits and then prints the list of fruits. And down here I have a list of a whole bunch of fruits: apple, banana, tomato, and then I print that. Then we run this fruity function, and then we print fruits again. And as we've seen in the past, we might expect fruits to stay the same after this function is run. However, that is not the case. Sorry, I stopped my recording there. But as you'll see shortly, that is not the case. And if I run this, the first print is what we expect, where it's just apple, banana, tomato. And then fruity function will print the fruit list with kiwi added to it. Apple, banana, tomato, kiwi. But then when we go back and print fruits again, it has this kiwi item in it. And so an important thing to know is when you pass lists into a function, changes made to those lists will be made outside of the function as well. And this is because lists are passed by what's called reference. They're passed by reference. And as a result of this, any changes you make to a list, those changes will occur anywhere that list is mentioned. And so this is an important thing to think about, because it can mean you will get some weird errors in your code that you might not be able to explain given what you know, but hopefully by me explaining this to you now, you might be able to catch those things later on. And so those are the basics of functions. I'm going to go over a few more things. Feel free to stick around if you're interested, but those are the essentials, in my opinion, of what you should know about functions. All right, and so the next thing I'm going to talk about is default values for your arguments. And so say, for instance, we didn't want the design to always be required when somebody calls fancy string. If we want a default value, then we'll add an assignment statement and write our default value for our variable next to it. And so here we've opted for the squiggles. And as you can see, if I remove, or actually, how about this? I'll have one where we have the fancy dot pattern and one where we do not. And as you can see, if I run this, then in this instance, it uses our fancy dot dash pattern. And in this instance, it opts for the default value. And so another thing we can do is we'll add a default message as well, and we'll do hello, because that's what we used up here. And so now, if we run fancy string with nothing, it will have a completely default case. And so with all of these default values, what if you want to keep the default value maybe for our message, but only change the design? There's a way of doing that as well, which is specifying which variable in the function we want to change. And so the way of doing that is, here I'll literally write that the design should equal, and our fancy dot dash pattern. And so if I run that, you'll see that it keeps the default value for message, but it changes the value for design. And so there's how you work with default values in Python. Lots of built-in functions use this idea, and so it'll help you work with those, and hopefully it'll help you make functions that are a little bit more customizable. One example actually of where this is used inside of Python is in the print function, where we can write hello, and wow, that's weird. I guess I don't know why that showed up. But if I press enter, it'll run hello. But if we want to, typically see it goes to the next line. An invisible line break escape character is added to the end of print. But if we want to explicitly change the value of this ending character, you add a second argument called end and say what you want the end character to be. And so in our case, let's just make it a whole bunch of exclamation points. And you'll see when I run that, instead of having a line break character here, it uses these exclamation point characters. And I guess this isn't the best example of that, because it does still give us a line break and take us to the next Python shell line. But rest assured, typically there's a line break, and by specifying this end variable, we can change it. And so if you have multiple print statements that you don't want all to be on their own lines, this is a way of changing that. And we can also have an empty string set for the end value. And so if we were to do this in a Python code file, then it would not output a new line. It would keep us on this same line, and we could write more things on this line. Anyway, that's a little tangent, but hopefully you find that helpful, and thank you so much for watching, and have